May 1st, 1945, 10:30 in the evening. In a small apartment in Hamburg, Marguerite Hafer, 52 years old, mother of 3, her hands still bearing coal dust from the factory shift, turns the dial on her Volksempfänger radio. The BBC signal crackles through the static, then clears. German radio has announced that Hitler is dead. She doesn't move. Doesn't call to her husband in the next room. Just sits there, hands frozen on the dial, while the British announcer continues speaking words she can no longer hear over the sound of her own heartbeat. Everyone expected relief, victory, liberation. The reactions that came instead would reveal everything about what 12 years of totalitarianism does to the human spirit. The official German radio broadcast came first, at 10:26 p.m. on May 1st, 1945. Not from Berlin. Berlin's transmitter was already in Soviet hands. The announcement came from Flensburg, near the Danish border, where what remained of the German government had fled. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen this afternoon at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism and for Germany. Fighting to the last breath. The lie was already being constructed, even as the Reich collapsed. Hitler hadn't fallen in battle. He'd shot himself in a bunker, while Soviet soldiers fought through the ruins of Berlin above him. But in that moment, millions of Germans heard only the official words. And then came silence. Not emotional silence, actual radio silence. The announcement ended, and there was nothing. No national anthem. No speeches. No instructions. Just dead air, and then music. Bruckner's 7th Symphony, solemn and immense, filling the emptiness where an empire used to be. In Munich, Ernst Schreiber, 68, a World War I veteran who lost his son at Stalingrad, sat in his daughter's kitchen when she rushed in from the neighbor's apartment, the only one on the block with a working radio. She was crying, but he couldn't tell if they were tears of grief or relief or exhaustion. "Papa, they're saying he's dead." "Hitler is dead." Ernst set down his coffee cup. His hand didn't tremble. He'd stopped trembling after Stalingrad, after the telegram came, after he'd stood in his small apartment and realized that everything his son died for, every promise, every certainty, every sacrifice, had been a lie. "I know," he said quietly, though he'd heard nothing. He'd known for months. Not that Hitler would die specifically, but that this was how it would end. With an announcement on a radio, and music, and people sitting in bombed-out apartments trying to understand what came next. In Hamburg, Marguerite finally called to her husband. Klaus came to the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been trying to repair their only pair of shoes. Leather was impossible to find. Everything was impossible to find. "What is it?" "Hitler's dead." Klaus stopped wiping his hands. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he just stood there. Then his face did something complicated. Not relief, not grief. Something that couldn't be named with a single word. "Are you sure? Is this another rumor?" Rumors had swept through Germany for weeks. Hitler was already dead. Hitler had fled to Bavaria. Hitler was negotiating surrender. Hitler would unleash a secret weapon that would turn the war around. Marguerite had stopped believing rumors. But this was the BBC, and then the German radio had confirmed it. It's real. They announced it. He's dead. Klaus walked to the window, looking out at Hamburg's ruins. 2 years ago, Operation Gomorrah had turned their city into an inferno. 40,000 people dead in a single week of bombing. The street outside their apartment was still rubble. The building across from them was just a shell, its interior completely burned out. "And it's over," he said. But his voice carried no certainty. "Is it?" Marguerite asked. Neither of them knew the answer. Across Germany, in cities reduced to rubble and villages still largely intact, in mound shelters and military hospitals and prison cells, people heard the news. And what they said, what they felt, what they dared to express out loud, none of it was simple. In Berlin, where Soviet soldiers already controlled most of the city, the announcement meant almost nothing. The battle was still raging. Shells still screamed overhead. People huddled in cellars didn't care if Hitler was dead or alive. They cared about water, about food, about whether they'd survive the next artillery barrage. But outside Berlin, in the Germany that was collapsing, but not yet conquered, the reaction was something else entirely. Nurse Helga Brandt, 29 years old, working the night shift at a military hospital in Stuttgart, heard it from a wounded soldier who'd been listening to a smuggled radio. He told her in a whisper, as if the Gestapo might still be listening. "They're saying Hitler's dead." She kept bandaging his arm, kept her hands steady. Around them, 40 other wounded men lay in beds. Soldiers with missing limbs, with shrapnel wounds, with infections that might kill them because there were no antibiotics left. "I heard you," she said quietly. "What do you think it means?" She tied off the bandage and looked at him directly. "It means you might live," that was all she said. But later, in the small room where the nurses took breaks, she sat alone and cried. Not for Hitler, for everything else. For the years of pretending, of staying silent, of watching people disappear and saying nothing, because saying something meant disappearing too. For the exhaustion of living in fear. For the relief that it might finally be ending. In the village of Berchtesgaden, in the Bavarian Alps, where Hitler's mountain retreat stood empty, and the surrounding area was still controlled by German forces, the announcement carried different weight. For 12 years, this had been sacred ground. The Führer's personal residence. Tourists had come here before the war, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Now, with American forces advancing, the remaining villagers waited for their world to end. Johann Lechner, the village baker 59 years old, his bakery still operating despite flour rationing, heard the news from his wife. She'd heard it from the postmistress, who'd heard it on the radio. "They're saying he killed himself," she added. "That's what the BBC is reporting." Johann kept kneading dough. His bakery was one of the last businesses still functioning. People needed bread. Governments rose and fell, but people needed bread. "Suicide?" he asked. "That's what they're saying." He thought about that. For 12 years, they'd been told Hitler was their salvation, their protection, their future. And he'd shot himself in a bunker while his country burned. Then he was a coward after all, Johann said quietly. His wife glanced at the door, an instinctive reaction even though there was no one to hear them. Old habits, old fears. Even with Hitler dead, people were still afraid to speak freely. What German civilians said when they heard Hitler was dead depended entirely on who they were, where they were, and what they'd lost. The true believers, those who'd embraced the ideology completely, who'd built their identities around National Socialism, who'd sacrificed everything for the party, reacted with something like grief. Real, genuine grief. In a small town in Franconia, a woman named Gertrude Hoffmann, 45 years old, local party women's league leader, her son killed in Russia, her husband killed in France, heard the announcement and collapsed. Not from shock, from the weight of realization. If Hitler was dead, what had her son died for? What had any of it been for? She sat on her kitchen floor and wept with a grief that felt like physical pain. Her neighbors heard her through the walls, but didn't come to help. They had their own griefs to manage, and Gertrude had been the one reporting people for defeatist talk. Her tears earned no sympathy. But Gertrude was becoming rare. Most Germans had stopped being true believers months or years ago. The turning point varied by person, by circumstance, by how much they'd lost. For some, it was Stalingrad in 1943, when an entire army was destroyed, and the propaganda couldn't hide the scale of disaster. For some, it was the bombing campaigns, when British and American aircraft turned German cities into burning graveyards, and the promises of protection revealed themselves as hollow. For some, it was the refugees flooding west from the Eastern Front, carrying stories of Soviet revenge, that made clear what defeat would mean. For some, it was watching neighbors disappear into concentration camps and realizing that, for the good of the nation, meant horrors they could not bear to imagine. In Cologne, where the cathedral stood somehow intact amid a sea of rubble, Father Wilhelm Hartmann, 52 years old, priest, protector of hidden refugees, careful dissident, heard the news during evening prayers. A parishioner interrupted the service, bursting through the church doors with the announcement. Father Hartmann stopped mid-prayer. "Hitler is dead," the man said, breathless. "It's on the radio. He's dead." The dozen people in the church, women mostly, elderly men, sat completely still. Father Hartmann looked at each of their faces. He saw relief there, yes, but also fear. What came next? Soviet occupation? American? Starvation? Revenge? "Let us pray," Father Hartmann said, "for the living, not for Hitler, for the living." It was the closest he'd come in 12 years to speaking openly about what he believed. Several of the parishioners started crying. After the service, an elderly woman approached him. "Father, is it wrong to feel glad?" "Glad?" "That he's dead." Father Hartmann thought carefully before answering. Even now, even with Hitler dead, he had to be careful. The habits of surveillance were deeply ingrained. "It's not wrong to feel relief that suffering might end," he said finally. "What you feel is human. All of what you feel, the relief, the fear, the uncertainty, it's all human." She nodded and left quickly, as if afraid of being seen speaking to a priest too long. In Frankfurt, in a cellar where 12 families had been living for months because their apartments were destroyed, Lot Schneider, 33, former schoolteacher, widow since her husband died, in Italy, heard the announcement on a battery-powered radio someone had saved. The reaction in the cellar was immediate but contradictory. "Thank God," one woman said. "Now they'll kill us all," an old man muttered. "The Russians will take revenge." "It's over," someone else whispered. "It's finally over." "The war isn't over," Lot said sharply. "Hitler's dead, but the Americans are still fighting. The Soviets are still coming. Nothing has changed except one man is gone." She was right, and they knew it. The announcement changed nothing material about their situation. They were still in a cellar. Their city was still rubble. Food was still impossible to find. But psychologically, something had shifted. A teenage boy, 16, too young to have been drafted, yet spoke up from the corner. "My father said we'd win. He said the Führer would lead us to victory." He died believing that. The cellar went silent. No one knew what to say to him. Lot finally spoke. "Your father was a good man who was lied to." "That's not his fault." The boy started crying. Quiet sobs he tried to hide. His mother held him, but she was crying too. How do you mourn someone who died for a lie? How do you honor that sacrifice without validating the ideology that demanded it? In the countryside, away from the destroyed cities, reactions were different, more practical, less ideological. Franz Bauer, a farmer in Bavaria, 61 years old, his farm still producing, though barely heard the news from a passing refugee. He was in his field, trying to coax something from soil that had been over-farmed and under-fertilized for years. "Hitler's dead," the refugee said. "Just heard it in the village." Franz kept working. "Is he now?" "They announced it on the radio." "Well," Franz said, turning over another shovelful of earth, "that won't bring back my 2 sons, won't replant my fields, won't stop whoever's coming next from taking whatever they want." The refugee moved on. Franz kept working. When people asked him later what he felt when he heard Hitler was dead, he said, "Relief that maybe I wouldn't have to watch anyone else die." That's all. Just relief that the dying might stop. But not everyone felt relief. Some felt terror. The announcement specified that Hitler had died fighting Bolshevism. This meant the war continued. This meant Soviet forces, already infamous for their treatment of German civilians as they pushed west, were still coming. In Dresden, Already destroyed by Allied firebombing 2 months earlier, refugees from further east heard the news with dread. If Hitler's dead, who will stop them? A woman asked, her voice carrying genuine fear. Who will protect us from the Russians? It was a question many Germans asked themselves. For 12 years, they'd been told Hitler was their protector. Now he was gone, and the enemy he'd promised to defeat was at their doorstep. Maria Wolf, 38, refugee from East Prussia, traveling with her 3 children after fleeing the Soviet advance, heard the announcement in a refugee camp near Nuremberg. She'd walked 500 miles to reach relative safety. She'd seen what Soviet soldiers did to German villages. She'd heard the stories, seen the faces of other refugees, understood what conquest meant. When she heard Hitler was dead, she felt nothing like relief. She felt abandoned. He left us, she said to another refugee woman. He started this war, and then he just left us to face the consequences. Maybe he was always going to leave us, the other woman replied. As the initial shock faded, as hours became days, a different reaction emerged. Not relief or grief or fear, but something more complex, something closer to anger. He'd left them. The man who promised to protect Germany, to make it great, to lead them to glory, he'd shot himself in a bunker while his country burned, while children starved, while cities lay in ruins, while women and children fled west in terror. In Hanover, a group of women, all widows, all with children to feed, all living in partially destroyed buildings, gathered in what used to be a park and talked openly for the first time in years. 12 years, one woman said. 12 years of sacrifices. My husband died in Africa. For what? So Hitler could shoot himself when things got difficult? They lied to us, another said. Her voice carried not surprise, but confirmation. About everything, about the war, about victory, about what they were doing to the Jews. All of it was lies. The mention of the Jews made several women look away. Even now, even with Hitler dead, even with everything collapsing, it was easier not to think about that. Easier not to acknowledge what had been done in their name. But one woman, Erica Stein, 40, former nurse, forced out of her job for refusing to participate in the euthanasia program, didn't look away. We knew, she said quietly. Maybe we didn't know the scale. Maybe we didn't know the details, but we knew. And most of us did nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had been said before. Finally, one of the other women spoke. What could we have done? I don't know, Erica admitted. But we should have tried. In Heidelberg, largely undamaged compared to other German cities, university students, the few who remained, most having been drafted or killed, gathered in someone's apartment. The news of Hitler's death gave them something they hadn't had in years, the freedom to speak honestly. I stopped believing when they closed the philosophy department, one student said. When they started burning books. When they made it clear that thinking independently was dangerous. I stopped believing when my Jewish professor disappeared overnight, another added. When the Gestapo came and took him from his home, and no one said anything. We all just pretended it was normal. When did you stop being afraid to say this out loud? Someone asked. No one had an immediate answer. Fear didn't disappear just because Hitler was dead. The Gestapo still existed. Nazi officials still held power in many places. Saying the wrong thing could still be fatal. But slowly, carefully, people were beginning to speak, beginning to admit what they'd thought but never dared express, beginning to confront what they'd witnessed and pretended not to see. In prison cells across Germany, political prisoners, those who'd survived arrests for defeatism, for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets, for helping Jews escape, for any of 1,000 crimes against the state, heard the news with a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. Hans Schall and Sophie Schall, leaders of the White Rose resistance group, had been executed 2 years earlier. Many others had followed them. The survivors, those who'd somehow lasted until May 1945, heard that Hitler was dead and felt a complicated grief. They'd been right. They'd known the regime was evil, known it had to be opposed, known the war would end in disaster. They'd been right, and it had cost them everything. "We were right," one former resistance member said when he was finally released days later. But that doesn't bring anyone back. That doesn't undo anything. The war didn't end when Hitler died. Not immediately. German forces continued fighting for another week. Some surrendered quickly. Others fought desperately, either out of loyalty or fear of what surrender would mean. The formal end came on May 8, 1945 VE Day, when what remained of the German government signed unconditional surrender. But for German civilians, Hitler's death marked the psychological end, the moment when the illusion finally, irrevocably shattered. In the weeks and months that followed, as Allied occupation began, as the full scale of Nazi crimes became undeniable, as concentration camps were liberated, and their horrors documented, Germans had to confront not just military defeat, but moral catastrophe. What did you do during the war? Became the question that haunted millions. What did you know? What did you ignore? What did you participate in? What could you have done differently? Some Germans claimed they knew nothing, hadn't known about the camps, the mass murders, the systematic genocide. Some of this was true. The regime had been secretive about certain operations. But much of it was willful ignorance. It was easier not to ask questions, easier not to investigate, easier to accept official explanations. Marguerite Hafer, the woman who'd first heard the announcement in Hamburg, was interviewed decades later. In 1985, when she was 92 years old, a documentary filmmaker asked her what she remembered about the day she heard Hitler was dead. She thought for a long time before answering. "I remember feeling relieved," she said. "Not happy, not triumphant, just relieved that maybe the lying would stop. For 12 years we'd lived with lies we told ourselves, lies the government told us, lies we agreed to believe, because believing them was easier than facing the truth." "What truth?" the filmmaker asked. "That we'd given our country to a monster. That we'd applauded while he destroyed everything decent. That we'd looked away while he murdered millions. We told ourselves we had no choice. We told ourselves we didn't know. We told ourselves we were victims too." She paused, looking at the camera directly. Some of that was true, but not all of it. And the part that wasn't true, that's what we spent the rest of our lives living with. Ernst Schreiber, the World War I veteran who'd lost his son at Stalingrad, was asked a similar question. What did he feel when he heard Hitler was dead? "Anger," he said immediately. "Rage. My son died for a lie. Hundreds of thousands of young men died for a lie. Our cities were destroyed for a lie. And the man who told that lie took the cowardice way out and left us to face the consequences." He was 88 when he gave that interview. His anger hadn't diminished in 4 decades. "People ask if I hate Hitler," he continued. "I don't. Hate requires caring, and I don't care about him at all. I hate what he did to my country. I hate what he did to my son. I hate that he made us complicit in horrors we didn't fully understand until it was too late. But Hitler himself," he shrugged. "He was a failed painter who talked well and promised simple solutions to complex problems. We were fools for listening." Father Wilhelm Hartmann continued his ministry in Cologne after the war. He helped rebuild the church community, worked with refugees, counseled people struggling with guilt and trauma. When asked about May 1st, 1945, he said, "I felt relief and terror simultaneously. Relief that the nightmare was ending. Terror at what might come next and what we'd have to face about ourselves." "What did you mean by that?" the interviewer asked. "We'd have to face what we'd been silent about, what we'd witnessed and not opposed. The small acts of cowardice that enabled enormous evil. I'd kept people safe where I could, hidden refugees, resisted in small ways. But I'd also stayed silent when speaking might have mattered. We all had." He died in 1962, never quite at peace with his wartime choices. even though he'd done more than most to resist. The German civilians who lived through Hitler's death and the war's end spent the rest of their lives processing what they de-experienced. Some became vocal advocates for democracy and human rights. Some remained bitter and resentful, convinced Germany had been a victim rather than a perpetrator. Some never spoke about it at all, carrying their experiences in silence until death. But one thing united almost all of them: the recognition that they lived through a historical catastrophe, and that their response to it, whether resistance or compliance, courage or cowardice, had mattered. When people ask what ordinary Germans thought when Hitler died, Schneider said in a 1990 interview, they expect a simple answer: relief, horror, grief. But it wasn't simple. It was all of those things and none of them. It was the end of a nightmare, but also the beginning of a different kind of nightmare, the one where you have to face what you lived through, what you enabled, what you failed to stop. She paused, looking at something the interviewer couldn't see. I was 33 when Hitler died. I'd spent my entire adult life under the Nazi regime. I'd taught children Nazi ideology, because that was what teachers did. I'd believed some of it, doubted some of it, resisted none of it openly. When I heard he was dead, I felt relief. But I also felt like I was waking up from 12 years of sleepwalking. And what I saw when I woke up was unbearable. On May 1st, 1945, at 10:26 p.m., the German radio announced that Adolf Hitler was dead. Millions of Germans heard the news. What they said, what they felt, what they dared express varied as much as human nature itself. Some grieved. Some celebrated quietly. Some felt relief. Some felt terror. Some felt anger. Some felt nothing at all, too exhausted by years of suffering to register one more catastrophe. Many felt all of these things at once, the emotions shifting and contradicting each other, because human responses to enormous events are never simple. But underneath all the varied reactions was a common thread: the recognition that 12 years of their lives had been given to a lie, that the man who promised to make Germany great had instead destroyed it, that the ideology they'd been told would save them had instead made them complicit in horrors they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to comprehend. Johann Lechner, the baker from Berchtesgaden, was asked in 1978 what the announcement meant to him. He was 92 then, still living in the same village, still making bread. "I remember thinking," he said, "that I'd have to tell my grandchildren about this someday, that they'd ask what it was like to live through Hitler's Germany, and I'd have to explain it somehow. I'd have to explain how ordinary people like me, who just wanted to bake bread and live quietly, how we let it happen. How we got swept up in it, or stayed silent, or convinced ourselves we couldn't do anything." He looked out his bakery window at the rebuilt village, at the peaceful street, at the mountains beyond. "I don't think I ever found the right words. I don't think there are right words. All I can say is that when I heard Hitler was dead, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 12 years and could finally breathe again. And then I breathed and realized I was standing in ruins." The German civilians who heard Hitler was dead didn't react as one. They reacted as millions of individuals, each carrying their own history of complicity and resistance, courage and cowardice, belief and doubt. What they said in that moment revealed not a unified German response, but the complex, contradictory truth of what happens when an entire nation must confront the collapse of everything it was told to believe. They'd survived the war. Now they had to survive the peace. And for many, that proved to be the harder test.